should I even be on D2C?
The sneaky reality is when you take out the middleman, you have to worry about demand creation yourself. And at that point, the differentiating factor really is marketing and messaging.
If you don't check these boxes, then just don't dive into D2C. Dylan, we're back. Episode 29. What's happening, man?
Not much. Excited to chat today, John. It's another episode 29, another one of the books. Keeps on flying by.
Yeah, man, I'm stoked for today. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Actually, I've developed some strong opinions from recording this podcast with you, which has been really, really fun. It's helped me refine a lot of my thinking. And I'm starting to circle around this idea, which I've mentioned maybe in the last couple episodes, really sophisticated growth strategy, right? Both from a finance perspective and a marketing perspective in D2C. It really starts with understanding the game that you're playing. And part of the game is, should I even be on D2C? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How to know your brand should be on the D2C channel. So, Dylan, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you around this topic?
Yeah, I'd say that like the instance where it's probably the most obvious is if you are inherently a high LTV store. And the reason why is because one of the knocks against D2C is that, the whole like argument for D2C is you take out the middleman, you take out retail, and you can basically have more margin for yourself. But in many cases, the sneaky reality is when you take out the middleman, you have to worry about demand creation yourself. And oftentimes, demand creation can actually cost more than the margin hit to the middleman. Having said that, when you have like high LTV over time, and you don't have to keep on spending ad dollars to retain the majority of that revenue, when that occurs, the marginal opportunity of D2C is often far greater than the margin you could have selling those same units in retail. So I'd say high LTV is probably the most obvious one and the biggest argument for kind of focusing on DTC initially. Um, I'd say the other big one, and this can kind of apply to everything, like ideally everyone has higher gross margin in almost every scenario. But I do think for D2C specifically, you are going to need high gross margin, especially if you don't have high LTV when factoring in some of those acquisition costs. So I say those are the two biggest ones. There's a couple of others that I think matter a lot, but curious your thoughts, John, and if you agree on those two things, or have any others you want to add to the mix.
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking about as you were talking, because I've seen this plain and clear in several brands, financial analyses that have been doing both on the CFO audit side in our sales pipeline as well as with active clients, is and this what I'm about to explain right now, this kind of like seesaw or balancing act, this exists at a more macro level within a brand as well. It's this notion that, and this financial law, that the first time I was exposed to it, not in the DTC context, is that the lower your gross margin at the company level, the faster you have to turn through inventory, and vice versa, right? So like the classic examples, like a grocery store, tend to have super low gross margins, but their turnover's crazy. They only hold like 7 to 10 days worth of inventory. Now, contrast that with a really high gross margin. You can't afford to turn your inventory fewer times or slower throughout the year. Same thing, in my opinion, with gross margin and LTV. Let me explain. There's a coffee brand that I work with that does not have a solid gross margin. When you look at it on the spectrum of gross margins, both from a percentage of revenue standpoint and a dollar standpoint, but their LTV is so insane. 3-month LTV, insane. 4, 5, 6, 7-month LTV, insane. After 12, it keeps growing. Their LTV velocity is so fast that it offsets the fact that they have a low gross margin. So obviously, the most amazing combination is having high gross margin coupled with like high LTV velocity, but you can sacrifice one. There's kind of the seesaw balancing act where if one is higher, it can offset the other being lower. Do you see the same thing?
Yeah, Absolutely. And I think that kind of just gets into like certain categories are just like built for D2C. Like oftentimes like supplements, vitamins, some of these like generally higher margin categories with high LTV. The one drawback to some of these categories though is that they're hyper competitive. So
Totally.
when you're selling more of a commodity, you often then have to also have a different like a true like unique value proposition that your competitors don't have because it's really hard to win a game selling something that everyone else sells because over time your margin will generally get deteriorated even if it works for some amount of time. So that's when you have to have something like a truly unique mission, and or kind of like niche group within the broader category. If you
Totally.
can crack the whole category, you're probably going to be able to print money because often these categories are huge, but generally from a defensibility standpoint long term. But yeah, broadly speaking, like high gross margin, high LTV are kind of like table stakes for making D2C work. At the bare minimum, I'd say like 50% margin after variable costs is generally going to be a necessity to make D2C work. There are some edge cases where margins worse than that can still succeed. In some cases with like higher AOV stores, if you have a lot of margin dollars, you can still make it work. Where even if you have 25, 30, 40% margins, the dollar value is enough to kind of, give you space on cost of acquisition. But I'd say like high gross margin and high LTV. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these ad platforms are like, you have to remember that you're not just bidding against, like if you're selling, I don't know, um, fuzzy t-shirts, just think of a random product. If you're selling a bunch of fuzzy t-shirts and you're advertising to people who buy fuzzy t-shirts, they also may be getting ads for like, I don't know, some insurance company or like some other like category with infinitely better lifetime value than your
Mm,
product has.
yeah.
And when you compare that, you know uh, hypothetical LTV to yours, you have to really keep in mind like if you're not going to win the LTV game, you have to really, really, really be methodical about how do you improve your gross margins over time.
One thing I was thinking of as you were saying that, well, let's see, I don't want to go off on a tangent here because I do want to go back to the mission purpose driven piece. There's a brand that I work with. Their gross margin is only 33% before ads, which is on the
Mm.
lower side, and their AOV is only $57. So if you look at like gross margin dollars, it's not very compelling. But because the product that they sell gets consumed on a monthly basis, they just accumulate LTV in margin dollars at such a
Like
fast
a beast.
velocity. And it doesn't really fall off. You see a lot of these brands like they make it to month 6, 7, and that's good enough to lose money on their new customer acquisition, but it kind of falls off. These guys just keep on going. But you know why? They have this niche mission driven purpose, and all of their ads and content are very, very focused on that. The group of people that they're advertising to like have a very strong belief in that mission, right? And but the other thing I was just thinking of, we actually didn't have on the list, but came to mind as you were talking is, and this is I think more of an edge case. This is an exception, not a rule, but I do have a few brands that we work with at Free to Grow that are influencer led, right? There's a very strong case to be D2C if you yourself are an influencer with a meaningful following. Again, usually it's mission and purpose driven, right? And the product helps carry out that mission. But that's another kind of factor that I've seen be really, really successful on D2C. Um, I want to chat next about high education factor, which is something you brought up as we were prepping for the episode. But this is pretty near and dear to my heart in terms of my experience because this is what drove us to go D2C at Guardian Bikes. We were not originally D2C. We originally were trying to sell to traditional channels. Namely, we started with independent bike shops. So that we could go kind of like teach these mom and pop shops the value prop of our patented Sure Stop brakes so that they could kind of have these conversations on the floor, right, about what made our bikes better. Because if you go to like mass market retail for bikes, Walmart, Target, there's no one there to explain anything. So in our mind, the education factor was going to be fulfilled through these independent bike shops. What we found was a game of fragmented telephone, right? Where we were going to hundreds and hundreds of bike shops that are just selling a couple Guardian bikes a month, right? Nothing crazy. And we're educating them on how to educate their customers on Guardian bikes. And through a game of telephone and, lost in translation, the value proposition is not being communicated effectively and consistently. So we literally, by necessity, got driven to D2C because we had to ask ourselves from a first principle standpoint, if we can't get consistent messaging through independent bike shops, where can we go to do that? And direct to consumer through our website, through content, through our ads was the place that made sense. And that's ultimately why, Guardian is still a D2C brand today. What are some of the other things that you see related to high education factor that help a brand be successful on the D2C channel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, if you think about the types of CEOs or founders who have excelled often in the D2C landscape across the brands that we've touched, a lot of the founders have been like arguably like marketing first people. Even if
Mm,
they're product people, they often have great like marketing ability. The premise of D2C is basically you take out people in the process and you go direct to customer. And when you go direct to customer, you're responsible for your own demand creation. And the reality is that a lot of D2C products are like not necessities. I mean, some brands are selling necessities, but a lot of them are discretionary products that you don't necessarily need. And when that's the case, the way in which you differentiate a lot of the time compared to your competitors, unless you have a truly new and novel thing, is storytelling,
mm,
is marketing. And I think that this entire ecosystem that is direct to consumer is just built up on firstly great product. You can't go anywhere without it. But even if you have great product, oftentimes there's competitors with great product. And at that point, the differentiating factor really is marketing and messaging. So I think that if you were to like launch a lot of these brands, go wholesale resale first, it'd be really hard to win against
totally.
some of these like legacy competitors. You may even be more expensive. Even if you're equally as good or slightly better, if you're 20-30% more because you don't have economies of scale, at the end of the day, like probably not going to go well. So I really think that this is like just the ecosystem, the place to start for so many business owners.
Totally.
But there are definitely exceptions.
Well, actually, a really awesome example is Heart and Soil, a brand that we work with. Started by an influencer, Paul Saladino, right? Around the carnivore diet and other things. He's written books but his whole movement as a content creator was around eating clean and healthy based on, he's a doctor, based on the research that he's done and using his methodologies on himself to cure some of his own kind of ailments. And so they started off being influencer led, but then they immediately went to like D2C was the obvious channel, and they just kept telling the story again and again and again and again to get people to like really galvanize around this mission of changing your diet to heal these various ailments. But then what was a natural offshoot of that is that they had to go source the supply chain that sustainably could provide the high quality products that were needed to stay true to this original purpose. So then that became a part of the story, right? And so they have a bunch of content that you can dive into where they're talking about the story of like where they source everything. So now supply chain is a part of the story, right? Not just like the founder influencer. Now they have a bunch of different sub stories from all around the various functions of their business that like where's the best place to to tell that story. D2C, they're expanding into retail now that they're a sizable brand, but imagine just seeing like cattle colostrum pills on a shelf at a retailer and not understanding who Paul Saladino is and that whole story, not understanding the story of like where all of this stuff is sourced from. It's on a shelf with just a bunch of other probably look-alike products. How do you differentiate it? Well, they have built this army of raving fans, and they have all of this content that's out on the internet at this point, as well as in their advertising. And so now when you see that, you already know what Heart and Soil is, right? And so it makes sense for them to now be in retail, but they scaled to multiple 8 figures before they really meaningfully started like looking at that channel expansion.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think like the counter to this would be like, well, can't you build that kind of like brand affinity in retail? And the answer is like probably yes, but probably for a lot more money. Like the barrier of
Totally.
entry, just in terms of like upfront capital, is probably just going to be way higher. Like D2C is just so cost efficient at acquiring customers comparably to other channels when you're first getting going. When you have a storytelling element, like the beauty of direct response marketing straight to online is just it can just be so effective. There are a lot of businesses that start D2C that in their optimal form probably should not have the majority of their revenue be DTC, but it doesn't change the fact that it was a good place to start initially just to prove product market fits. Very unlikely they would have actually succeeded going to retail first.
It's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking, I'm good friends with Dean, the CEO of Heart and Soil, because they're out here in Austin. We've become friends over the years. He specifically is a storyteller. He had no e-com experience before this. He was in content creation before this. And it's not surprising that he has excelled as the CEO of Heart and Soul because he took this existing story from Paul Saladino and was like, I'm a storyteller. I know how to curate and capture and distribute and publish this story. And it's a big part of their success. And so I think that just runs in like very tight alignment with what we're saying here. Um, Another thing you brought up as we were preparing for this is another way to know that you maybe should be on D2C is skill set. You want to double click into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, like if I were to start a brand tomorrow, not that I'm planning on it, but I would probably start in D2C just because I know so much about it. Like I have a huge competitive advantage compared to the average person starting in this ecosystem. And if you are someone who has been working in D2C professionally for a good amount of time, maybe you're someone who is like, at a brand currently and you want to basically do your own store, do your own company. Like it very well may make sense for you to go and start in that ecosystem just because it's where you have the skill set. On the flip side of this, I've seen brands get started or have like an initial launch on retail, and the owner founder has a great Rolodex of contacts, and they just rip
Yep.
because they have the contact database of some of the main buyers from huge purchasers that they can
Such a
just
good
get
point.
started. So it's like I don't have that Rolodex, so I'm probably not going to go and do that unless I feel that for some reason, even though I'm very experienced D2C, I'm more likely to then go and basically launch in wholesale for some other reason that I can't think of off the top of my head. But it's probably if I happen to like have a partner or know someone who has the Rolodex, bring them into the business to kick it off initially. So I'd say that like broadly speaking, the benefit of going where you have the skill set is that you have a competitive advantage compared to other people, and you've paid down what I would call like someone else coined the term, but it's like ignorance debt. It's like you just know so much about what not to do. Now, if you
Yeah.
go into another channel, you're just probably going to make a lot more costly mistakes. And that's pros and cons of everything.
That makes me think there's this content creator in the real estate investing world named Dave Meyer. He runs one of the Bigger Pockets podcasts about real estate, and he always talks about like, hey, look, as an investor, right? And you need to think as an investor when you're talking about like what channel should I start a business in and why, right? Um, as an investor in real estate, you should try new things, but don't change two variables at the same time. So, for example, if you're a long term buy and hold investor in Mississippi, change one variable and try short term rentals in the same Mississippi market, or keep doing long-term rentals in Austin, Texas. You're only changing one variable. But if you then go from long-term rentals in Mississippi to short-term rentals in Austin, Texas, that's super risky because you're changing two variables at the same time, two parts of the business model that you don't know and you don't have experience of. And it's kind of like it's very aligned with that ignorance debt kind of concept that you just mentioned. And so I think the other thing that I want to add to what you said about like say not starting in retail operations is a very specific skill set. Running ops from I'd say ops and finance, but they're very closely intertwined. The cash conversion cycle is different, right? Planning and forecasting is different. And I'll say I think a whole lot harder because you don't have your own direct demand signal from purchasers. It's usually third party through the retailer, and it's always wrong, and the POs never align with it. And then on the cash conversion cycle side, you've got heavy accounts receivable where you're floating receivables usually at least 60 days. But if you're a new brand, unless you have pre-existing like relationships, it's probably 90 days. And so the question is like, how are you going to finance that cash conversion cycle gap? Do you know Kanpai Foods, the guys who are doing the freeze-dried candy?
Rings a bell, but not super familiar.
So we know we have a mutual friend, one of the co-founders and I have a mutual friend. I got on a call with them about potentially investing in that business when they first got started. And they have this crazy growth trajectory, like tens of millions of dollars in revenue, like in like the first year, expected to get to like multiple 8 figures by year 2, back ordered orders from all these big retailers. But why? Because of the previous businesses that they ran and the previous like the network that they had built. I didn't invest because I just don't understand physical retail like that. I'm like, this sounds cool to go from zero to like super profitable and crazy revenue, but like, I don't get this, so it's risky to me. So I didn't even invest my dollars into that business because I didn't understand it. Same kind of thing here, and like I would say, I want to tie this into a financial reason why D2C might be good for your brand. That's very connected to what we're talking about here. If you're capital constrained, usually if you're going to expand or if you're going to launch in retail first, or that's going to be the first meaningful channel, and you don't have a ton of experience there because of the cash conversion cycle, because of the pay to play nature of having to go through, like pay slotting fees and go through brokers and all that kind of stuff, you got to raise capital on the front end, right? Usually at least 7 figures of capital to get started. There's very few bootstrapped, retail heavy startup CPG brands because it takes more capital up front. You're placing a bet on a lot of potential scale, right? If it's successful, because like retail channels have such big TAM, but you've got to raise money on the front end. So many D2C brands that I encounter, they started because they're self-funded, they're bootstrapped, they're capital constrained. And it was a channel where they could get started and they could test product market fit and they could test scaling economics with their own cash or a little bit of cash that they raised from friends and family. And so I think that makes a huge difference as well.
Yeah, 100%. You always hear stories. I'm biased because we're like predominantly focused on D2C, so we see a lot of D2C first brands. But we also do come across from time to time a brand that started on Amazon that did well and moved over to D2C. But they don't always move over well. Sometimes they do.
Totally.
But oftentimes you have to kind of re-engineer a little bit your offer and how you're thinking about it to make it work on D2C. Because if you're selling something for $22 with limited AOV and the margins are 30%, it's like there's the makeup of what works on all channels can sometimes be the same, but often it's not. And if you're ever gonna like jump into D2C and you started somewhere else, you may have to, in a way, like rethink what your offer will even look like on D2C to make it so
Totally.
that it's economically viable.
Well, yeah, I mean, to take it a step further, because we come across a lot of Amazon brands who want to get into D2C, but going back to those first couple bullet points that we covered in this conversation, they don't have high enough gross margin dollars per order. They don't have high enough 3 to 6 month LTV. When those two things are false, right? It makes it very, very hard. Sometimes impossible. Sometimes I have to tell those brands like, hey, just you got to stay on Amazon. And I think your next move is probably physical retail and is not D2C, unless you have some like new product line where the high gross margin dollars per order and the high 3 to 6 month LTV problem has been fixed. And that's not an impossible problem to solve, but it's a harder problem to solve with a longer tail on it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Are there any other kind of like instances where you think that a brand really should be starting on D2C, or do you think we covered all the main ones?
There's one more, which I think aligns with skill set a bit, is like if you have, and look, there's a few brands I've come across that they have this and they crush it. If you have really long lead times, right, you may not be able to generate a better cash conversion cycle on D2C than retail. May or may not, right? The reason being because you can finance the cash conversion cycle of real long lead time POs with vendors. If you get a PO from a retailer, you can use PO financing. It's high interest, but you can finance that cash gap. If you have really long lead times and bad payment terms with your vendors, you might have a crappy cash conversion cycle on D2C relative to retail. That's hard to finance because lenders don't like financing prepayments and in-transit inventory to overseas vendors. But if you have local vendors and you have short lead times and you can keep inventory really, really lean or relatively lean, you can create a much better cash conversion cycle than you could in retail because there's no AR. You're selling it. And if you get really good, this goes back to skill set, maybe pre-existing network. Like I know a couple second-time founders that get this, and they had some vendors that they already had really incredible relationships with, and on day one they got like net 60 terms or like net 90 terms, but they're holding less days of inventory than the days of AP that they had. So they actually created a negative cash conversion cycle. If you have the ability to do that, you can actually potentially have a lower gross margin as well, because you don't need those gross margin dollars to buy more inventory. You have a negative cash conversion cycle and you're using your customers' cash. So going back to that brand that I said that has a 33% gross margin dollars, most of their inventory is drop ship and they pay for it the week after they ship the order and they collect the cash from the customer. So they're able to lose money on new customers at a low $57 AOV times 33% gross margin, but people replenish every month. So high LTV frequency, but then a negative cash conversion cycle. And when you combine those, these guys are printing money at just like 10 million a year in revenue. I mean, they're printing cash flow left and right. There's other things to consider about being a dropship brand, but the point I'm making is if you can engineer those things on the front end, D2C is a great business and far better than retail. So that's the other one that I can think of.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that the a lot of brands that start like with a dropship model but then transition away from dropship because it's less I less commonly see dropship models actually like today than I did years ago. It's nice because they often get sold on the idea of, hey, we're gonna have this many more, gross margin dollars when we don't do drop shipping, when we pay for stuff in advance. But it's a whole other game when it comes to cash flow. And I think that like
Totally.
I always try to tell people when they make that swap, it's like, hey, like theoretically this is gonna be a lot better for you, probably better for your customers too. But make sure you have this stuff dialed in because it's a beautiful thing when you can sell inventory before you have to pay for it.
Totally, totally. And by the way, I will mention, don't just go try this because it's easy to do on like Alibaba or like some random like Chinese factory or something like that. Don't go do that. The brand I'm talking about, their manufacturer is local to where they live. They have a very tight relationship with them, and their manufacturer actually has their own brand. And so they're arbitraging, or they're generating economies of scale by combining their demand, and they foster it in person on a very regular basis. They're very transparent about growth and whether or not capital investment needs to be made, and so to keep up with demand. And so it is possible, but again, it's relationship driven, it's skill set driven, right? But just know that exists. If you can pull that together, it can be a dream. Any final thoughts that you have on this topic, Dylan?
At the end of the day, I really think that the skill set piece matters a lot. I think that like just going after the channel that you have the most experience in will probably be the best scenario for a lot of people. Even if it means you then pivot to something else relatively quickly afterwards, there's usually some opportunity in every channel if you have that experience in the in your backgrounds. And yeah, I mean, I think that like a lot of the best C2C brands do have high gross margins, high LTV, but you also have a lot of exceptions. So, like, I guess at the end of the day, we always say what we like to see because we analyze so many different brands. But also, reality is that it's sometimes hard to have all of these elements. So it's totally possible to succeed even if you only have some of them.
For sure. Yeah, man. I think my final thoughts are like just what we laid out here it's a checklist for you to decide what game you maybe should play. In this case, we're talking about the channel selection game, right? And we're trying to make that decision less arbitrary. There's always edge cases, there's always gray, but the checklist that we gave you today, like if you check a lot of these boxes, then you can know with confidence that D2C is probably a great place to start. If you don't check these boxes, then just don't dive into D2C without considering how might you be able to check these boxes with strategic changes that you make in your business. And if you don't want to do that, then what other channels might work for your brand? So anyways, I think this is a great one, and I'm looking forward to episode 30.